Once they feel secure in the relationship, maybe after a big commitment like marriage or a shared home, a pregnancy, they flip the script. Suddenly they're cold, cruel, and dismissive. It doesn't even have to be suddenly. Sometimes that behavior kind of builds over time, but often it's quite sudden, right? Quite abrupt. And the sad part is they exploit the fact that we expect everyone to play fair and be kind. So while they're secretly being abusive to everyone else, the abuser seems like a stand-up partner. So this really makes it incredibly tough for the person on the receiving end to seek help because the abuse isn't obvious. It's concealed behind this mask of normalcy. What's at the core of this issue really is deception, right? It's not just harmful. It's narcissistic abuse is a type of abuse all on its own.
Hey there, lady. I'm Molly Connolly, your coach and hype woman on this journey to transforming your love life. Whether you're navigating life after divorce, exploring the world of online dating, or deepening the connection in your committed relationship, I'm here for you. Why me? Because I walked this path myself, from filing for divorce just 3 years into marriage, to swimming in the online dating pool into my late 30s, and finally marrying the man of my spreadsheet dreams right before the world changed forever. I've seen it all. As a relationship coach, I empower women to create love lives filled with clarity, connection, and confidence. This podcast is all about building a strong foundation for a healthy relationship with yourself and your future partner. I believe the man of your spreadsheet dreams is worth the wait, and together we'll ensure that you are ready for him when he arrives. Join me each week as we dive into insightful discussions and hear from savvy guests. You'll gain the courage to break free from limiting beliefs, recognize and change patterns that are holding you back, and learn to prioritize the number one relationship in your life, the one you have with yourself. So let's embark on this exciting journey together. Welcome to Reinventing the Arena. Hey there, lady. Welcome to the Reinventing the Arena podcast. Today's guest is Dr. Michelle Roberts. She is a journalist, psychotherapist, and professor who helps women discover how past trauma influences their current relationships. She has studied relational trauma for the past 25 years, first as an award-winning journalist and now as one of the nation's leading researchers and clinicians focused on the modern epidemic of narcissistic abuse. Her seminal research illustrates the stark correlation between romantic involvement with a dark personality and a woman's early life experiences. Michelle completed her doctorate in clinical mental health counseling at the University of Missouri in St. Louis, where she has taught psychopathology and diagnosis as adjunct faculty. She holds a master's degree in education from UMSL and journalism from Northwestern University. In addition to her career in journalism, Michelle served as the executive director of Bravely, a residential program for women with histories of trauma and addiction leaving sex trafficking. She was a founding director of one of the nation's first nonprofits dedicated to health literacy and author of several books designed to help people manage their mental health for the Institute for Healthcare Advancement in Irvine, California. Michelle holds a license to practice psychotherapy in Missouri and Oregon. She serves as a contributor on the Oxygen Network's Mastermind of Murder, where she provides insight on dark personalities. Her research on empathy has been presented multiple times at the American Psychological Association. Michelle, it is an honor to connect with you today and share your insight, your wisdom with my listeners.
It's so great to be here, Molly. Thank you for having me.
Of course. I know the introduction included multiple areas in your career path, but what inspired you to make women's relational trauma your life's work?
Yes. Well, I, of course, observed it so much in my role as a journalist and really understanding the stories behind all of the statistics on the challenges that are in women's life. And because women are such relational creatures, most of the challenges we face are in that sphere of relationships and relational trauma. So I think it started there. Of course, it started in my own life and challenges that I faced in that area. So I'm a voracious learner. And so in kind of my effort to really understand kind of why we get super glued into ideas and relationships that don't serve us the best as women, um, in trying to learn about that for myself and people close to me and what I was
Mhm.
observing in the world through my career, it was just kind of a progression for me. And it wasn't so much that I set out to do it or that I understood I was doing it at the time. But looking back, I can see the progression from
Mm.
journalism to nonprofit director to clinician. And so here we are.
Your research emphasizes the psychological impact of narcissistic abuse. How do you define narcissistic abuse and what makes it different from other forms of intimate partner violence?
Yeah. So narcissistic abuse, it's a form of emotional and psychological manipulation that
Mm.
often occurs in relationships where one person has narcissistic traits. And, we hear that everywhere in culture now, and I'll get to that in a little bit. But essentially, it's characterized by behavior, right, that undermines the victim's self esteem, their sense of reality, and their overall emotional well being. And so these kind of behaviors, and again, we hear a lot of these being bandied about: gaslighting, constant criticism, a lack of empathy, and leaving the victim confused, insecure, and isolated. So imagine someone who's like a master at pulling strings to make their partner question their own reality. That's what we're dealing with here. It's the kind of abuse that's all about control, but it's not as obvious as other types, right? It's subtle, it's sneaky, it uses the victim's own perceptions against her. And this can happen in family relationships, like our parents. It can happen at
Mhm.
work, even. And it especially happens in romantic relationships, which was the focus of my research. So, a person with what's known as pathological narcissism, right? At first, they come off as Prince Charming, attentive, caring, empathetic, but unfortunately, this is just a front. So once they feel secure in the relationship, maybe after a big commitment like marriage or a shared home, a
Mhm.
pregnancy, they flip the script. Suddenly they're cold, cruel, and dismissive. It doesn't even have to be suddenly. Sometimes that behavior kind of builds over time, but often it's quite sudden, right? Quite abrupt. The sad part is they exploit the fact that we expect everyone to play fair and be kind. So while they're secretly being abusive to everyone else, the abuser seems like a stand-up partner. So this really makes it
Mm.
incredibly tough for the person on the receiving end to seek help because the abuse isn't obvious. It's concealed behind this mask of normalcy. What's at the core of this issue really is deception, right? It's not just harmful. It's narcissistic abuse is a type of abuse all on its own. It's a deceitful relationship that can lead to what's known as traumatic bonding, and relational trauma, right? Where the abused person forms an unhealthy attachment that's hard to break free from. And believe it or not, emotional bonds are often stronger when they're forged in adversity than in good times. Okay? So the cycle of narcissistic abuse, and I know we'll talk about this, has this distinct pattern to it, starting with the narcissist presenting themselves as the ideal partner. But once the relationship is solidified, their true nature emerges. And it's a far cry from the loving image that they projected. We're talking about, inducing jealousy, infidelity, verbal attacks. And sometimes it escalates to physical violence, but that is not the defining feature of narcissistic abuse. So that's, the term, like I said, narcissist gets thrown around a lot, but we're not
Yeah.
talking about someone who's just a bit self centered. There's a whole spectrum to narcissism. And on the far end, you've got people who lack empathy, feel that sense of entitlement, and can be downright hostile when they don't get their way. So, I guess when we say narcissistic abuse, we're talking about that harmful pattern that's more than just self-love gone too far. And it's really critical to recognize it for what it is.
That explanation just hits so deeply. The amount of times, just looking at what my clients have gone through, what your clients probably have gone through as well, and having to really ask, is it what you talked about, like social media, pop media saying this and this, or is it really this? And how to then really make women aware of, like you said, that emotional tie, that adversity, going through these troubles with someone that you care or you believe to care about and love, and how this can keep you stuck in this pattern, in this cycle with someone. So your study that of your dissertation, found a strong connection between early life trauma and adult relationships with narcissistic partners. Can you elaborate why early life trauma is critical as a predictor for these experiences?
Yeah. Well, we know that my study results correlate, traditional domestic violence statistics as well, right? Where women who get into more traditional domestic violence relationships also tend to have experienced trauma early life. So my study was the first to look at it specifically for narcissistic abuse, but it does correlate with broader domestic violence literature. But essentially, to answer your question, in my study of 2,000 women who identified as narcissistic abuse survivors, the women in my study scored 4 times higher than normative statistics for the presence of early life trauma. Okay, that's significant.
Wow. Yeah.
It's really important to understand, how early life trauma can shape our adult relationships. So to measure that, I used what's called the ACEs test, Adverse Childhood Experiences Test. Many of your listeners may have heard of it, but it basically measures various types of childhood trauma, including emotional, physical, sex abuse, as well as neglect and just general household dysfunction. And it's a really helpful tool for understanding how these experiences can impact a person's emotional development and relationships later in life. So, again, the women in my study scored 4 times the normative scores. And we know that early life trauma can create these patterns in how we view ourselves and our relationships. So for many, these experiences can lead to low self-esteem, heightened need for validation, and, difficulty establishing healthy boundaries. When someone has experienced trauma early on, they might unconsciously gravitate, right, toward relationships that mirror those early experiences, even if they're harmful, and even if we know they're harmful, and even if we have a desire to break out of those harmful patterns, we still do it. Okay. So the more kind of scientific term for that is a repetition compulsion in trauma. And I won't go into that too deeply. It's kind of inside baseball. But there's a lot of literature supporting that happens for all kinds of trauma. So this can create this cycle where a person feels drawn to partners who replicate the emotional chaos or instability they grew up with. And they often believe that love must come with pain or confusion. So many of my clients, right, when they're dating after a narcissistic relationship, really have trouble dating normal guys.
Yes.
It's like, he's so boring. I know
Oh,
he's so
yes.
nice, but I don't feel it. I don't feel it, right? Because our nervous systems orientate and associate that sense of quickening and excitement, right, with love, when really that might be fear, right? Or,
Right.
right? Or a warning sign that when we're not feeling that, we just feel kind of dead inside. So that's just kind of a practical example of what I'm talking about here. So again, early life trauma becomes a critical predictor because it can shape how we perceive love and intimacy.
Yeah. I love how you called that out with the feelings.
Mm-hmm.
I describe that with some of my clients, like the emotional roller coaster that they love to be on. They love feeling the highs, they love feeling the lows, because to them that's exciting, that's drama, that's love, that's relationships. But like you said, it's the nervous system. It's because it's been ingrained also in us with previous behaviors and chaos that we might have been used to from other relationships, which makes so much sense. But the amount of times I've heard from some clients, like, I'm tired of dating boring men. I just want to date this person. And it's like, is he like your ex, or is he like that relationship? And they'll say, oh, but he's not, because he's charismatic. But you bring that up, that they have that facade in the beginning. So I really want ladies that you're listening right now, if you need to pause this, go back and re-listen to this. It is so critical to understand what Michelle is bringing up, because it is very important to your growth and for your ability to have a healthy relationship. With that said, like, your work really does highlight specific personality traits in survivors, such as elevated empathy and cooperativeness. How do these traits attract both narcissistic partners and keep survivors in these harmful relationships?
That's such a thoughtful question. I'm really glad you asked that. Okay, so here's what my research found on that. Slightly more than half of participants reported above average empathy, with 12.6% scoring as super empathizers, which is the highest category, right? It's also interesting to note, right, that elevated empathy also in my study predicted greater intensity and severity of complex trauma symptoms, but we'll get to that a little bit later. So, you know, if you go anywhere on Instagram or social media, TikTok, you'll see all of these memes in kind of the area. You know, if you're looking up anything on narcissistic abuse, where we're empaths, right? And they're, and you know, and they're evil, and there's all of this kind of lore around narcissistic abuse relationships that almost feels a little bit kind of spiritual in nature, where the good versus the evil, the empaths versus the psychopaths. And so my research actually, the question that led to me including an empathy score in my research really was informed by that part of social media. I really wanted to understand and see, is this for real? And the truth is that people did score above average empathy, and a much greater percentage than the normal population scored as super empathizers. But let's peel that apart a little bit. What does that really mean? Another thing that my study found was that the presence of altruistic and self-directed personality traits also existed. So it's really fascinating how certain personality traits can play a role in the dynamics of these relationships. Elevated empathy and cooperativeness are admirable qualities, but they can also make us more vulnerable to attracting narcissistic partners, right? Survivors with high empathy often have a deep desire to help and understand others, which can be incredibly appealing, right, to narcissists who thrive on attention and validation. Narcissistic partners may initially be drawn to this empathy, as it can make them feel special and valued. But over time, you know, this same trait can become a double-edged sword. First of all, you're with somebody who doesn't think the same way you do, doesn't act the same way you do. So your beautiful empathy, when directed in most other situations, is a great gift, you know, can become a huge vulnerability when you're with someone who will exploit that empathy, right?
Yeah.
It's a double-edged sword. Survivors might find themselves prioritizing their partner's needs and feelings over their own. And that leads to a cycle where their own well-being takes a backseat. So in addition to empathy, cooperativeness, which we measured on the Big Five personality score, can also play a role. Survivors might go along, right, with their partner's demands or preferences to maintain harmony, again, at the cost of their own happiness and well-being, and create a pattern where they feel responsible for keeping that relationship afloat, making it harder to recognize the toxicity of what they're in. And it's interesting, self-directiveness scores also kind of lay on top of that. You've got someone who's feeling responsible for keeping the relationship afloat, but who's also very directed and, wanting and has the capability to, they go after things they want. The women in my study and the women I work with in my practice every day, they're no shrinking violets. They're very, successful in their work and most of their other relationships because they have this kind of self-directedness to go after what they want. So it's a really interesting kind of array of personality scores that I found in this study and that other people who've looked at this have also found. But let's peel back that layer a little bit, right? Trauma adaptations often shape these personality traits, right? So someone who's experienced early life trauma might develop heightened empathy, right, as a way to navigate their environment and keep themselves safe. So they may have learned that being overly attuned to others' feelings is essential for survival, which can lead to a strong focus on others at the expense of their own needs. So over time, this can keep survivors, super glued, right, in harmful relationships because they might fear conflict or abandonment if they assert their own needs, which is often a repetition from what they experienced as children, right? So standing up for themselves might feel like they're betraying their values of empathy for others because setting boundaries for those of us who aren't used to doing it or where it wasn't safe for us in childhood, where we never really learned it, can make us feel like we're being mean or living outside of who we really are. So you can see where this alchemy of personality traits can really also contribute, right, to this dynamic between someone with very low empathy and very low cooperativeness when paired with someone with very high traits, the opposite end of that spectrum. Yeah.
Exactly. And I like how you even brought into, or you're saying that, you have some high achievers that you work with and people that are very self-focused and like you said, self-directed.
Mm-hmm.
And I know I wasn't going to ask you this, but just curious how that also plays a part sometimes with trauma, where maybe someone was having to learn how to be independent on their own, and also then become empathetic for when these situations of trauma that came in. So how those overlap and cause this sort of high achieving, successful woman who still now needs to place empathy and cooperativeness at the forefront to then have this hypothetical relationship survive.
Mm-hmm. That is a very astute question as well. I see that all the time. When you're raised, for example, right, with very negative messaging about who you are, or even just being invalidated more generally, right? A survival strategy to that is to work super hard to prove and to feel, right, that you're not those things. And there's many adults, whether we're aware of it or not, who are super high achievers, are in an endless hamster wheel to prove our worth. And so often we do that externally, right? Thinking that that's going to lead to that internal feeling. It doesn't.
Yeah, no, it does
I
not at
learned that
all.
lesson, right?
Okay.
You win this award. Okay, that's gonna do it. Okay, what's next, right? And so you spend all of those efforts in your external life trying to prove, and a lot of good can come to that,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's this degree, then that degree, this promotion, then that promotion, this award, then that one. But that's not inherently a bad thing. But again, it's that double-edged sword. If you're doing it to prove your basic worth inside, if that's not there, you're still not going to feel better. And so I see that a lot in the women that I work with. I would say that's definitely part of my own story and women in my family. And
Yeah,
that's hard because we often get missed, right? Because we've got it together from the outside, right? But not
exactly.
feeling it on the inside. Yeah.
Yeah, the self-worth hamster wheel, looking for that
Mhm.
outside validation when all we need to do is to find it internally within ourselves because it's been
Mhm.
there all along.
Yeah.
I love how you call that out, like the women that you've worked with, part of your story, part of my story. It's almost like it's generational, in a sense, but then overlapping the early, early life trauma, and how this all plays together with narcissistic trauma from a
Mhm.
partner. And you've touched on little things as we've been going along, and you're like, oh, we're going to discuss this later, and maybe this is it. But your research shows a high prevalence of complex PTSD among survivors. Yet a few receive this diagnosis. So, what
Mhm.
barriers prevent this proper
Mhm.
diagnosis and treatment for women, do you
Yeah.
believe?
Yeah. Yeah. So this, I think, was the part of my research. You get all of these surveys in, and you've been working for a year doing data collection. And when you do your first pass, I'll never forget when we did the first pass on this data and these numbers came in, and I was just floored.
Mhm.
So in my study, almost three-fourths of participants, 73.3% to be very statistically accurate, 73% of participants met the clinical criteria needed to diagnose PTSD or CPTSD, which is complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Yet only 4% had been diagnosed with the disorder.
Yeah.
Okay.
That is
Um,
shocking.
yeah, it is. 88%, right, met the criteria for PTSD, which is a more widely known and I think understood diagnosis among the clinical community. 88% met the criteria for PTSD, yet still only 10% had been diagnosed. So it wasn't just a problem with understanding what CPTSD was for the women or for the clinicians that these women were encountering. They were also missed for their PTSD by and large. So
Mm.
um, let's talk about that a little bit. Complex PTSD refers to a specific type of trauma response that happens after prolonged exposure to traumatic situations. And this is often involving interpersonal relationships, like those seen in narcissistic abuse and in child abuse for that matter, right? And it includes symptoms like emotional dysregulation, negative self concept, difficulties in relationships, and just kind of a pervasive sense of fear and hopelessness. So while CPTSD is gaining recognition, it's still relatively new diagnosis compared to the more established PTSD, right? Um, so let's talk just about relational trauma a little bit. This again occurs when deep emotional harm is experienced within relationship, particularly when there's a power dynamic that leads to manipulation or abuse. In the context of narcissistic abuse, relational trauma can be especially damaging as the narcissistic individual might exploit and degrade the victim's sense of self worth and autonomy. Um, CPTSD is a diagnosis that expands on traditional PTSD. It was first proposed by Dr. Judith Herman of Harvard University in '88. to kind of address the symptoms of long-term trauma. PTSD is recognized in what we call the DSM, right? The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. But CPTSD has not yet even made its way into the DSM, right?
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So it's an evolving and quickly evolving category, which could contribute, right, to the fact that women are not getting that diagnosis, which is essential, because that's what, by and large, they have. But still, it doesn't explain everything, because PTSD, they're not getting that diagnosis either, at the
Right.
level that they need it. So it's essential that we get this diagnosis more well understood. Often women show up in my office and I don't make a diagnosis, right, based on what they say about their partner. It's not even necessary for me to fully understand or to interview or to, have videotapes or recordings of their partner to make a diagnosis of CPTSD, because she shows up with this array of symptoms that are so pervasive and debilitating that it's clear that she has experienced it, right? Or she
Got
wouldn't be
it.
presenting with these. So there's 5 key features that set it apart. Emotional flashbacks, toxic shame, self-abandonment, a harsh inner critic, and social anxiety. Those are the 5 I look for. Emotional flashbacks in particular are a prominent hallmark of CPTSD. And these are kind of like sudden and intense emotional regressions to past trauma that she's not even fully aware of. So emotional flashbacks are like, they call them amygdala hijackings, right? To the overwhelming feeling states of her childhood abandonment or previous instances of abuse. I had one, I'll give you an example of this. I had one client who described this emotional flashback situation so well. She was shopping in a grocery store, and all of a sudden, she was just overcome with this sense of fear. She started sweating. She felt helpless. She felt like she was collapsing back into how she used to feel when she would hide under her bed, right?
Mm.
And she couldn't figure out why. On the music, I should say, playing, there was a song she associated with her abusive ex-husband, narcissistically abusive ex-husband, that he used to play a lot. And she wasn't even fully aware or hearing it specifically because it was on music, but just that little subtle environmental cue was enough to completely put her into a flashback, right? And when you're stuck in that kind of flashback, um, fear, shame, or depression can just dominate your experience. These are, I talked about, an anxiety, flashback with her. They can also feel just kind of like a sludgy, fuzzy, depressive state out of nowhere that you're not sure why you're feeling because nothing really has changed, right? So emotional flashbacking, where you're feeling little, fragile, and helpless. Everything feels too hard suddenly. Life is too scary. Being seen feels excruciatingly vulnerable. Your battery seems to feel dead. The worst of these flashbacks can feel like an apocalypse that's going to be imminently upon you. When you're trapped in a flashback, you are reliving the worst emotional times of your childhood. And because we know this strong correlation, right, between adult narcissistic abuse and childhood trauma, you can see how these symptoms can become really overwhelming, right? So in essence, CPTSD goes beyond the typical symptoms of post-traumatic stress and includes this range of emotional and psychological challenges that really can impact us. Yeah. And so we have to do psychoeducation so survivors have a better sense of what they're experiencing. And we have to do more in the clinical community to really move therapists, who work in all specialties to a basic understanding of what CPTSD looks like when it shows up in our offices so that we can either take on some of those additional trainings that will be helpful, or we can refer these clients to the best care, this more specific care that they need. Because talk therapy, just plain talk therapy, rarely gets survivors to where they need to be.
I can't even imagine putting myself in the shoes of your client in that shopping center moment of just
Mhm.
being in the grocery store and the strength of just being
Mhm.
able to leave or to keep moving throughout the day because of how she subconsciously picked up that song and her body
Mhm.
instantly knew that something bad was going to happen because of previous
Yeah.
moments. And that for so many people is just, I can't even imagine. Like I said, I just can't even
Mhm.
fathom the
Mhm.
women that go through this and how you're able to help them figure out that correlation so that they
Mhm.
at least have the awareness to start bringing the power back to themselves in a sense, and then working through all
Mhm.
of what you do with them, because it's not just, like you said, it's not just talk therapy one and done. Like there's a lot that goes into the type of therapy that you do, the psychotherapy. So um I greatly appreciate you sharing that one example. So
Mhm.
what are some practical steps that you feel that survivors can take to start not only healing from narcissistic
Mhm.
abuse, but recognizing it too?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing is I guess what I want to say is this damage is intense, right?
Mhm.
Um, Complex CPTSD is an injury that can be healed. Um, and I do believe that. I see women recover all the time, and it's beautiful. And it's a process, right? It's a long process, but I think what most people don't understand is that, you know, those who suffer from narcissistic abuse, let's just talk about that because that's our topic, right? Become neurologically impaired, right? It's part of what
Mm.
keeps them in the relationships. It's not just, the violence and the abuse we endure. Over time, these repeated emotional injuries shrink the hippocampus of our brains. It's responsible for memory and learning, while enlarging our amygdalas, right? Which house those primitive emotions like fear, grief, guilt, envy, and shame. So the longer we stay with abusive partners, the more deterioration we can expect of our
Mm.
hippocampus and our brain function, right? And this neurological process leads to feelings of confusion, cognitive dissonance, abuse amnesia, um, and in fact, our brains fail to help us reason out of these relationships. So I guess what I would say about what to do, and I think women are getting better. So much of what's out there on social media is pure crap. However, what I like about it is that um, it is a starting point for understanding that she has experienced something different and needs a specialized approach. And so I feel like the first thing to do would be to try to find a therapist that has some of these buzzwords in their in their bio, right? Um, Things like EMDR, eye movement
Yes.
desensitization reprocessing therapy, um, internal family systems, IFS, right? Somatic experiencing or somatic approaches to complex trauma recovery. A clinician who is listing this skill set is someone who's going to be able to get you closer to where you need to be. Also, DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, which is for emotion dysregulation. Many complex trauma survivors, because of the emotional dysregulation they're experiencing, kind of get saddled with a borderline personality, not always, but sometimes diagnosis, which isn't always accurate, and also can lead to trouble finding a clinician who to work with. So while DBT can be is a really actually good thing to learn, it working with someone who specializes in borderline personality may or may not get you to where you need to be. So let's go back to the client in the grocery store, right? How I treated her was we played a snippet of that song in an EMDR session. So she would hear it, she would get the physiological response, and then we would do the repetitive movements, right? And so what that allowed her brain to do was disconnect the physiological, auto response from that song and what was associated with it, which was abuse, right? From that automatic response in her body. So when the next time she hears that song, instead of feeling that as a 10 out of 10, right, in a negative or distressing way, she might only register that as a 2 or 3 out of 10. The difference between that in your everyday life, when you're taking lots of those different triggers together and treating them, can be just dramatic, right? Because that emotional dysregulation that comes up in a flashback gets greatly diminished, which allows you to bring your brain, the thinking part of your brain, back on board and make better decisions about how you're going to respond versus just doing an automatic response, like, all sorts of things, black and white thinking, catastrophizing, all of those things that we do when, we're not completely on board. So EMDR is great. It's the one that I use most often, but there are other really good and emerging trauma modalities that you should look for when you're trying to find a therapist. A lot of people just go to see more of a generalist who does CBT. That can be a good starting point for you to just kind of get a better understanding of what you've dealt with. However, I have found that therapists who haven't studied, but I think sometimes more importantly, haven't experienced narcissistic abuse, have trouble really plugging into the experience. They might be an amazing therapist and highly skilled in so many ways, but I have found that often clients, when they find their way to me, have felt really invalidated, even by really good therapists who don't totally recognize the symptoms and don't understand how damaging it is. Because often women get into the office and they even have trouble finding the words for what's happened to them because their brains feel so scrambled. So what I would say is you're not going crazy. This is a symptom of the trauma that you've been in. And if you get yourself, in the right hands and you do some of the right readings, you're going to get a language for this pretty quickly that can help relieve these symptoms relatively quickly. It's when we get caught in the wrong kind of care that we can get even more discouraged about moving through.
Yeah. EMDR is so powerful. I actually went and had EMDR therapy for 13 months years ago. And I will definitely say that, once again, you kind of like brought up the social media issue. There are people that are like, oh, I'll teach you taffy or whatever they want to say. And I'm like, that is, don't listen to those people. I want you to work with a licensed therapist in EMDR. Don't follow someone on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, whatever you want that talks about tapping unless they say they are a therapist, and also say that social media is not therapy. You need a one-on-one person to do this work. It is 100% my belief of engaging yourself and saying you are worthy of going to therapy. You are worthy of healing yourself and working with people that know this. And this is another quick thing that I just love how you called it out. If a therapist, it doesn't mean that they're a bad therapist. They just might not be in tune with what you need. And so never feel guilty with having to find a new therapist that is more aligned with what you need to have a solution for. So ladies, please, 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 I recommend if you need EMDR, get into it. You will have so many breakthroughs, and your sense of self-worth, your confidence is going to really be at a whole new level because you never fully experienced it.
And another thing I want to say about that is that not all EMDR therapy is equal, and not all EMDR therapy is right for you. And I learned this the hard way as well. So many therapists go through EMDR training, and they learn a very traditional set of protocols, which is the basis for the theory and necessary to know. I find that the best type of EMDR therapy is kind of a subset, right? It's an extension of training that therapists who are going to work in complex trauma really need to consider, and it's called attachment focused EMDR. So that's another buzzword you might look for. And basically what it is, and I'll try to keep this as general for, a lay audience as I can, but it is an approach to EMDR that is a little bit more gentle, is much more focused on building up positive resources than even initially discharging negative ones. So if you imagine, right, your life, over here we have this reservoir of all the worst things that happen to us. The deep, dark, gurgling lake of blackness, right? And over here, we have a beautiful, serene little pond of all the good experiences we've had or could imagine for ourselves. Well, how our brains work is when we've had trauma, the pathway to the dark, gurgling pond is deep and it's automatic. Over here, there's no path to that lake. It might even be surrounded by trees, right? We don't automatically go there, even remember that it's there. In our traumatized brain, so the second something happens, we go straight to the worst case scenario because that's where the neural pathway heads, right? So attachment focused EMDR in the beginning works on clearing a path to this lake. So we have this for us when we're confronting those harder memories in EMDR. So an attachment focused EMDR therapist, I feel, works best for this kind of trauma because, we're building a lot more resources in order to do the work. And also, it's a gentler approach. An EMDR therapist might not say, okay, tell me, will likely not select a trauma memory that is too big. He or she will select something that doesn't even necessarily feel like a trauma, but feeds into it because it's a gentler approach and you'll get there. What I've seen happen a lot is that people with complex trauma have gone to a good EMDR therapist, but who doesn't really understand, again, complex trauma and the application of EMDR to that. So what has happened is they have unintentionally taken that person and got her way outside of her window of tolerance. So she's done a session or two of EMDR. It was so intense. She had total shutdown or she dissociated during it and doesn't want to try it again. And that is sad because with the right approach and a slower approach, right, EMDR actually still could be pretty helpful to you. So that's just a caveat that I like to mention, just because so many of my clients come and they are reluctant to do EMDR because they've done it before and got really overwhelmed by it.
No, that makes sense, because when you have a lot of trauma, it's like you just want to peel the layers of the onion just a little to get you into that center to help remove it, because then you have proof that it works on the outside.
Yeah.
So, well, Michelle, what do you want the ladies to know or take away from our conversation today?
That healing is not outside your hands. You already have all the ingredients for it inside of you. And what we really need is somebody that we trust, that we can build trust with over time, and to do the real work. There's no bypassing for this, right?
No.
There is no, and believe me, right? You cannot yoga this away in and of itself, right? You can't pray your way out of this in and of itself. All of those things are valid, but you're going to probably have to do a lot of different things that include mind, body, and spirit, because that piece of it is important. It's whatever you choose that to be for yourself. But it's rarely just one thing. It's an ongoing day-to-day commitment to yourself and your own well-being. And by doing a bunch of different things and finding what works best. For some people, it can be a morning meditation with bilateral stimulation, or, the binaural beats, starting with that, right? Going for a walk, eating healthy food. It's really anything you can do as an act of love towards yourself. And in the beginning, it's hard to do that. It's not natural. So in the beginning, it's going to feel kind of maybe even trite and weird and uncomfortable to start doing those things. And over time, it's gonna catch. My own therapist started me with an exercise I'm going to teach you and your women right now, because when she first presented it to me, I thought, oh, this is kind of lame. And I was a therapist when I said that, right? And I, first of all, I was surprised by how difficult it was, how out of touch I was with myself to even clue into this. But as I did it over time, it changed something fundamental, right? So it's about simple things that over time change something more fundamental. And my therapist called this the Holy Trinities. And the first part of it is you say out loud 3 brags about yourself. So I brag, right? Do you want to try it, Molly?
Oh my goodness.
If you don't,
sure. No, this is fun. Okay.
I'll do it. But okay, 3 brags about yourself.
Wow. Oh.
Okay, do you see that resistance?
Yeah. Well, okay. I was like, what is a brag? Like, I was like, what is an example?
Yeah, I'll give you one. I, Michelle, brag that I am a good dog mom.
Yes. Okay.
It can be anything.
I brag that I feel like I'm a really good wife. Okay. I brag.
I'm going to challenge you. Yeah. I brag I am a good wife.
Ooh.
I brag I'm a good wife. And feel that. Did you feel that in your nervous system, saying it out loud?
I feel tingles, like somewhat of like anxiety, but at the same time, like confident. It's a weird flow.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes. Just notice that. What you're doing is you are tapping into your nervous system right now. Okay, 2 more.
Oh boy. I love this. This is really challenging. I feel like I am a great coach.
I brag I am a great coach.
I brag that I'm a great coach.
Good.
Same weird. Now it's traveling to other areas of my body. Wow. It's getting into my legs. This is fascinating. Women, you need to do this. Okay. Another
We're
one.
teaching them how to do it right now so they can do it on their own. So one more. I brag.
I brag that I am a loyal friend.
Mm-hmm. Good job, Molly. The
Mm.
first time I did this, I had a real hard time with those. It was so hard to tap into that positive feeling about myself and say it out loud, right? But those body sensation, that tells you there's something to it for you, right? There is for all of us.
Mm.
Okay, the second part of the Holy Trinities is 3 things you're thankful for.
Okay. I just practiced this before you and I got on our call.
Mhm.
I am grateful for my loving relationship with my husband.
Mhm.
I am grateful for the freedom in my calendar to do the things that I love. I am grateful for all the amazing women that I get to work with day in and day out.
Beautiful. Well done. And the last part is 3 desires. Now,
Ooh.
this doesn't have to be big time goals, right? When we're starting out, many of us aren't as tapped into what it is that we really want. I would notice myself working all day and being thirsty, but not
Mm.
tapped enough into my own desire, right? To I love it. Take a drink.
I'm like, actually, I am thirsty.
See? I'm tapped enough into my own wants and desires and needs to like act on it. So
Mm.
so the desires can be big or they can be super small. One of my first desires is I desire a glass of ice water with a lemon wedge, right?
Ooh.
Okay. So when you're thinking of desires, you're going to give me 3, but one of them I want you to make doable within the next 24 hours, where you actually do it for
Mm.
yourself. The other 2 can be anything.
Oh, I desire an hour to read, to sit down and read. Oh my gosh, I want that so bad. I desire sitting outside around a campfire again.
Mhm.
That possibly could happen in the next 48 hours. I really desire time to, oh no, that's, I have time. Everyone has time. See, now this is tough. This part's tough.
Mhm.
Um, I desire the the creativity and the freedom to just start painting. I haven't painted in a long time, and I've been waiting to do it for and perfectionism's getting in the way. So I know
Yeah.
that one.
Yeah. Beautiful. So this is just a gentle exercise, right? And you can do it anytime, that brings you back into your nervous system, into yourself, and you felt all the tingles, right? We often
Mm-hmm.
don't even realize, you know, how, and I think this is for women in general, not just complex trauma survivors, but it's sim- simple exercises like this that kind of bring us back into ourselves. And how do you feel now afterwards?
I actually feel like invigorated. I
Yes.
am so, and I'm so in tune with myself, so
Mhm.
much more physically than I thought I was before. It's
Yes.
amazing.
Yeah. And women will also experience this as kind of like a downshift, where it's kind of like, because we're back in, right, to ourselves. So it's seemingly simple things like that exercise, right? That on paper you wouldn't really understand how powerful that can be until you start to do it. So so moving forward for women, it's finding a good therapist, doing the things that feel good, starting with some seemingly simple rituals and practices that can keep bringing you back to yourself. And that those are the building blocks that eventually will unleash the healing power you already have in you. And you're the
Mm.
best guide to what feels good and for you. And I would just say go with that. And it's really
Yeah.
hard to do this work alone. And the investment that you make in that, it's worth every penny because it's your life.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. I can't even fathom who I would be right now if I didn't go through EMDR, because it was this foundational point for me to really start honing in on my own personal development, which then shifted the course of my life to do what I'm doing right now and have the husband of my dreams. So
Exactly.
completely.
Exactly.
Yes.
So, oh my God.
Well, Michelle, before we end today, please not only tell everyone where they can find and learn about you, but is there anything that you wanted to offer the listeners to possibly participate in, or know more of what you might be having coming up?
Yeah. Well, I have, if you go onto my Instagram, now keep in mind, this is a footprint. If you might be disappointed in my Instagram page, it's basically just telling you who I am. And I don't get on there and do a lot of active teaching
Right.
because I'm wary of that. And I don't know that it's a message that I personally want to send, but it will lead you right to things you might be interested in. There's a link to my dissertation on my Instagram page. There is a link to two websites. One is for my private psychotherapy practice. I am licensed in Missouri and in Oregon, where I now live. There's also a link to, we didn't talk about this much, but another new emerging treatment for trauma is psilocybin and general psychedelic therapy. So I'm one of the very first clinicians in Oregon offering that to clients. And it's not for everybody, but it's a really exciting frontier. And my goal is always to kind of stay on the cutting edge of what really works for
Right.
healing and moving us through trauma. So there's another website for that. And there's a link. I have a healing guide that kind of lays out how, 5 therapies, modalities that really work for complex trauma healing and tells a little bit about those. And you're welcome to sign up for that as well. That's on my link tree in my Instagram, which is otherwise fairly inactive. So, yeah.
And I will include a lot of links also in the show notes. So, Michelle, thank you so much for your insight, your wisdom, your time today. I know this impacted so many women that are listening. It's such a pleasure to have someone like you join me.
Yeah. Oh, Molly, it's just a pleasure to be here. And you're a testimony to your own healing. It's great. And the women you work with, you are lucky.
Oh, well, thank you so much. And once again, ladies, EMDR therapy, get you started for those of you that need it too. So.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you for joining me on the Reinventing the Arena podcast. I'm your host, Molly Connolly, a relationship coach devoted to helping women reinvent their love lives. Tap the subscribe button so you never miss out on an episode. You can always find me on Instagram at Reinventing the Arena or learn more from me on my website at reinventingthearena.com.